close your eyes, take a slow breath in, and let it go. Tonight we are not going anywhere loud. We are not going anywhere urgent. We are going somewhere ancient, somewhere the air smells of salt water and warm stone. Somewhere the sea is impossibly blue, and the sun rises over islands that have been dreaming since before memory began. We are going to ancient Greece. We are going to follow one man, not a god, not a perfect hero. Just a man, a husband, a father, a king of a small rocky island who wanted nothing more than to go home. His name was Odysseus, and his journey home would take 10 years. Tonight, we are going to walk every step of that journey with him, from the burning ruins of Troy all the way to the shores of Ithaca. Through monsters and goddesses and storms sent by gods who held grudges the way the sea holds a ship, pulling it off course with silent, relentless patience. This is the Odyssey. One of the oldest stories in all of human history, a story that has been told for nearly 3,000 years, and that has never once lost the ability to carry a listener somewhere else entirely. So get comfortable. Let your body settle into whatever is holding you tonight. Feel the weight of your arms. Feel the warmth beneath you. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. Just listen. Before we begin, if you have found your way to this channel, and this story feels like exactly what you were looking for tonight, take just a moment to subscribe and leave us a comment telling us where you are in the world and what time it is where you are listening. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people across the world are settling into the same ancient story at the same time. Some of you in morning quiet, some of you in the deep middle of the night, some of you with rain on the window and a fan running and nowhere to be until morning. Whatever your corner of the world looks like tonight, welcome. You are exactly where you are supposed to be. Now, let the story begin. Long before this story starts, there was a war, not the war we are here to tell, but the war that made this story necessary, the war at Troy. Troy was a great city on the western coast of what we now call Turkey, a city of high stone walls and wide streets, and a royal palace that caught the light of the Aegean sun on its towers every morning for generations. The city had been built, according to the ancient Greeks who told its story, with the help of the gods themselves. Its walls were so thick and so perfectly fitted together from enormous blocks of stone that the ancient Greeks believed no mortal hand alone could have raised them. Inside those walls lived a royal family, a king named Priam and his queen Hecuba and their many children, among them a prince named Paris, who was handsome and charming, and who made, as handsome charming men sometimes do, a decision that destroyed everything. Paris sailed to Sparta. He was welcomed as a guest in the palace of the Spartan king Menelaus. He was given food and wine and a comfortable bed. He was shown every kindness that the laws of ancient Greek hospitality demanded, and then he sailed away with his host's wife, Helen. The Greeks called her the most beautiful woman in the world. Whether she went willingly or was taken against her will, whether she was a victim or a participant, is a question that the ancient stories themselves argue about endlessly. But what is not in question is what happened next. Menelaus called on every Greek king who had ever sworn an oath to defend his marriage, and one by one the ships assembled. From across the islands and the mainland of Greece they came, great heroes and ordinary soldiers, old kings and young men who had never seen a battle, 1,000 ships, the poets would later say. A face that launched 1,000 ships. Among those kings was one who had not wanted to come at all. He was the ruler of a small rocky island called Ithaca. He had a young wife he adored. He had a baby son who had only just learned to smile. He had fields and olive groves and a household that needed him. He had, in short, everything he wanted already, and he wanted no part of this war. His name was Odysseus. And the story of what Odysseus did when the Greek herald came to summon him tells you everything you need to know about the kind of man he was. He pretended to be mad. When the herald arrived at his palace on Ithaca, He found the king ploughing his fields with an ox and a donkey yoked together, which made no practical sense at all, and scattering salt into the furrows instead of seed. The king muttered to himself. His eyes were unfocused. He seemed not to recognize anyone. The plan almost worked. A madman could not be expected to fight. No army could reasonably demand that a king send his people to die in a war when the king himself had clearly lost his mind. But the herald was clever enough, or suspicious enough, to test him. He took the infant prince, the baby Telemachus, from the arms of his mother Penelope, and placed the child directly in the path of the plough. Odysseus turned aside without a moment's hesitation. The plough missed the baby by inches, and in that single involuntary motion, the king of Ithaca had revealed his sanity and ruined his own scheme. He went to Troy. There was nothing else to do. He had sworn the oath. He had been caught. He kissed his wife and he held his son, who was far too young to understand what was happening, and he sailed away toward a war he had tried to avoid. That was the last time he would hold Telemachus for 20 years. The war at Troy lasted a decade, 10 years of fighting below the walls of a city that would not fall. The Greeks built a camp on the beach and lived there through 10 years of heat and cold and disease, and the peculiar grinding exhaustion of a war that everyone expected to be over soon, and that never was. The Trojans stayed behind their walls and sent their warriors out to fight each day, and brought them back each evening, and the walls held. Great battles were fought. Great heroes died on both sides. Achilles, who was perhaps the greatest warrior who ever lived, fought with incandescent fury, and then withdrew from the fighting over a personal slight, and then returned when his closest companion was killed, and fought again with the grief of a man who has decided that his own death no longer matters. Hector, the Trojan prince who was a better man than almost anyone on either side of the war, died defending his city and his family and everything he loved. The gods themselves took sides and quarrelled and intervened, helping their favourites and punishing those they disliked with the casual cruelty of beings who have no stakes in the outcome the way mortals do. Through all of it, Odysseus fought. He was not the strongest warrior at Troy. He was not Achilles. He would not have claimed to be. What he was clever. He was the man the Greek commanders turned to when they needed someone to think around a problem rather than through it. He was the man who led the most dangerous missions, who volunteered for the night raids and the diplomatic negotiations that required someone who could read people and say exactly what they needed to hear. The goddess Athena favoured him above all the other Greeks. Not for his strength, but for his mind. She saw in him something she recognised. A mortal who thought the way she did, who valued the well-placed word over the blunt instrument, who understood that in the long run the cleverest plan outlasts the most powerful spear. After 10 years, it was Odysseus who ended the war, not with a battle, with a horse. The wooden horse of Troy is one of the most famous stories in all of human history, so famous that you may feel you already know it, but let us slow down and sit with it for a moment, because the details of it matter. After 10 years, the Greeks were tired. The Trojans were tired. The walls still stood. No amount of fighting on the plain below had brought them any closer to falling. Odysseus sat on the beach one evening and watched the sun go down behind those walls and thought. He thought for a long time, and what he came up with was this. They would build a horse. Not a real horse, but a wooden one, enormous, the size of a temple, hollow inside with room enough for men to hide. They would offer it as a religious gift, a dedication to the gods. Something so sacred that the Trojans could not simply ignore it or destroy it without risking divine anger. And then the Greek fleet would appear to sail away. The beach would be empty. The war would seem to be over. And the Trojans, relieved and celebrating, would bring the horse inside their walls themselves. The construction took 3 days. The craftsmen shaped the pine and the ship timber into something vast and strange and beautiful. a horse that stood 30 feet high, with hollow breathing holes in its sides, and a trapdoor so perfectly fitted into the belly that you had to know exactly where it was to find it. Odysseus chose 29 of the finest warriors and led them up the rope ladder into the darkness inside. They carried water and cloths to muffle any sound. They pulled the ladder up after them. The trapdoor sealed from within, and then they waited. The fleet sailed away in the night, not far, just far enough that the Trojan lookouts watching from the walls would see empty water by morning. When dawn came, the Trojans opened their gates and walked out onto the plain for the first time in 10 years, without Greek soldiers on the other side. The beach was empty, the camp was abandoned, the war was over. And there, alone on the sand, stood the horse. There was debate inside the city. There always is in the stories about this moment. Some Trojans said to burn it, some said to throw it into the sea. A princess named Cassandra, who had the gift of seeing the future and the curse of never being believed, said it would be the end of Troy. No one listened. They dragged it inside. That night Troy celebrated. Wine and music and the pure relief of people who have survived something they were not sure they would survive. Inside the horse, Odysseus and his 29 warriors lay perfectly still in the dark and listened to the celebrations below them and waited. When the city finally fell silent and the wine had done its work and Troy slept, the trapdoor opened. The rope ladder descended. One by 130 men climbed down from the belly of the horse into the silent streets of a city that did not yet know it had lost the war. They opened the gates. The fleet returned under cover of darkness. By dawn, Troy was burning. Odysseus stood at the prow of his ship in the weeks after, watching the coastline of what had been Troy disappear behind him, and believed the worst was behind him. He had survived the war. He was going home. He was wrong about the worst being behind him. He had no way of knowing that. He was heading home to Ithaca with 12 ships and their crews, and a ship full of plunder from the war, and as far as he knew the hardest part was over. He was wrong. Far above the world where mortals live and die and sail their ships and fight their wars, on a mountain whose peak was always above the clouds, the gods of ancient Greece had their own version of a governing assembly. They gathered in the golden halls of Olympus and argued and negotiated and occasionally agreed, and the decisions they made there cascaded down through the world in the form of weather and fortune, and the quiet, persistent nudges of fate. When the king of the gods, Zeus, called the assembly together one day, his daughter Athena was the first to speak. She spoke about a man, a mortal man, which was not unusual for Athena, who had more interest in human beings and their complicated affairs than most of the other Olympians. But this mortal was specific. He was being kept on an island in the middle of the sea by a goddess who had fallen in love with him and would not let him go. He sat on the shore every day and wept, she said. He stared east toward home and wept. He had been there for 7 years. His wife was besieged by men who assumed he was dead and wanted to marry her and inherit his kingdom. His son was growing up without him. His old father lived in grief. Athena's argument was direct. Odysseus had always honoured the gods. He had sacrificed properly. He had respected the divine order of things as best a mortal could. Why was he still out there on that island weeping when he deserved to go home? Zeus listened. He acknowledged the truth of what his daughter said. He explained the complication. His brother Poseidon, the lord of the seas, the earthshaker, the god whose domain Odysseus would have to cross to get home, had a grievance. Odysseus had blinded Poseidon's son, the Cyclops. We will get to that story in time. For now, it is enough to know that Poseidon's anger was real and had been simmering for years, and that it expressed itself in every wave and current and storm that stood between Odysseus and Ithaca. But Poseidon was away from Olympus, feasting at the edge of the world, and Zeus decided that with his brother absent, now was the time to act. He would send Hermes, the messenger of the gods, to the island where Odysseus was being kept and order the goddess who held him there to let him go. And Athena, meanwhile, would go to Ithaca. She had other business there. On Ithaca, in the palace that Odysseus had built before the war, a young man was trying very hard to be patient. His name was Telemachus. He was 20 years old. He had never known his father. He had been an infant when Odysseus sailed for Troy, and he had grown up on stories and descriptions and the expressions on people's faces when they spoke about the king who had not come home. For 20 years, Penelope had waited, not passively, not sitting quietly in a corner hoping things would work out. Penelope's waiting was active and intelligent, and required daily effort of a kind that was exhausting to sustain. Because the palace of Odysseus was no longer simply a palace, it had become something between a long party and a siege. The suitors had arrived. They came first in ones and twos. Sons of noble families from Ithaca and the surrounding islands who had decided, based on perfectly reasonable evidence, that Odysseus was dead and that whoever married his widow would inherit his kingdom. There was nothing strictly illegal about what they were doing. A widow needed to remarry eventually. The kingdom needed a king. These were the social realities of the ancient world. But the way they went about it was something else. They did not court Penelope from a respectful distance. They installed themselves in the palace. They feasted daily on Odysseus's cattle and sheep. They drank his wine. They treated the servants as their own. They lounged in the great hall as if they owned it, which they did not, and as if the question of Penelope's remarriage was already settled, which it was not. By the time our story begins, there were over 100 of them. Penelope held them off with a scheme worthy of her husband. She announced that she would choose a new husband when she had finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's elderly father, Laertes. It was impious to remarry, she said, while this sacred duty remained undone. The suitors could hardly argue with that. They watched her weave. The shroud grew longer and more elaborate with each passing day. What they did not know was that every night, when the palace was dark and quiet, and the suitors were sleeping off the wine, Penelope crept back to her loom and unpicked the day's work, thread by thread, row by row, until by morning the shroud was no further along than it had been the day before. She kept this up for 3 years. 3 years of watching the suitors consume her household and holding them at arm's length with a deception that required absolute discipline every single night. But eventually, as all secrets do, it came out. One of her own maids, who had taken one of the suitors as a lover, told them what she had seen. The suitors confronted Penelope in the great hall. They demanded she choose immediately. They gave her until the next harvest moon, and Penelope, for the first time in years, had no more delays available to her. Into this situation came Athena. She did not arrive as a goddess. She came disguised as an old sea captain, a friend of Odysseus's named Mentes. She found Telemachus sitting alone in a corner of his own great hall, watching the suitors eat his inheritance with the expression of a young man who has been angry for so long that the anger has become a kind of baseline, something he carries around the way other people carry around a sore back. What Athena did was not magical exactly, or not only magical, she talked to him. She reminded him of who his father was. She asked him the right questions. She pointed out that sitting in the corner of his own hall, watching men destroy his family's wealth, was not, in fact, something he was required to do. She told him to call an assembly, to stand up in front of the people of Ithaca and say publicly what was happening in his house, to order the suitors to leave, and then to go looking for his father, to sail to Pylos and Sparta, where the kings who had fought at Troy still lived, and ask them what they knew about Odysseus's fate. When she left, she did not leave as a human being leaves. She left as a bird, an eagle that launched itself from the threshold and disappeared into the sky. Telemachus stood for a moment, looking at the empty doorway, and then something in him settled into place. The assembly went roughly the way you might expect when a young man who has been quietly furious for years finally says out loud what everyone already knows. He stood in the harbour under the ancient olive tree, where his father had once held court, and he said, clearly and without apology, what the suitors were doing to his household. The suitors were not embarrassed. The most arrogant of them, a man named Antinous, stood up and said that the problem was Penelope's, not theirs. She kept delaying. She kept making promises and breaking them. Until she chose, they would stay. The assembly ended without resolution, but Telemachus had done something important. He had said the words out loud in public. The gods had heard. And that night, with a ship that Athena arranged, and a crew of loyal men who still remembered his father, Telemachus slipped out of the harbour of Ithaca before the suitors could stop him. He was going to find out what had happened to Odysseus, or at least to try. The ship arrived at Pylos with the sun still rising, and Telemachus found exactly the kind of scene that makes a young man feel very small and very young. Old King Nestor was on the beach with what seemed like half his kingdom, conducting a religious sacrifice to Poseidon. 9 groups of 500 men each, 9 bulls being sacrificed simultaneously. The smoke and the sound and the scale of it was overwhelming. Nestor was the oldest living man who had fought at Troy. He had been old even then, famous among the Greeks not for physical strength, but for the kind of wisdom that only comes from having survived so much for so long. He welcomed the strangers with immediate hospitality, feeding them before he asked who they were, which was the proper ancient Greek way of doing things, the sacred law of hospitality that was considered to be divinely enforced. When Telemachus explained who he was and what he was looking for, Nestor was kind. He was also honest in a way that was not entirely comforting. He had not seen Odysseus since the day they had disagreed about when to leave Troy after the city fell. Nestor had left immediately. Odysseus had stayed behind with others, who wanted to complete the proper religious rites first. That disagreement had meant different routes home, and Nestor had lost track of Odysseus entirely. What he could offer Telemachus was the advice to go to Sparta Menelaus. The Spartan king whose stolen wife had started the whole war had only recently returned home himself after years of wandering. He might know something. Nestor sent Telemachus to Sparta in a chariot with his own son as escort. Sparta was different from Ithaca in almost every way. Ithaca was small and rocky and practical. Sparta was wealthy in a way that even the walls of its palace communicated. When Telemachus arrived, the court was in the middle of a double wedding celebration. Menelaus marrying off both his daughter and his son on the same day. The hall was full of feasting and music, and the sound of an aulos player and a pair of acrobats performing between the tables. Menelaus welcomed his unexpected visitors with exactly the kind of warm and genuine hospitality that the laws of the ancient world demanded. They were bathed and given fresh clothing and seated at the best table before anyone asked them a single question about who they were or why they had come. And then Helen walked into the room, the woman for whom the war had been fought. She was older than she had been when the war started. Obviously, 10 years of war and more years of Menelaus's wanderings home had passed. But there was something about her that the ancient storytellers never quite managed to pin down in ordinary descriptive language. She was simply herself in a way that most people are not. She sat down and she looked at Telemachus with eyes that had seen the greatest war in the world and said quietly that he looked exactly like his father. The room went a little quiet. Menelaus agreed. He had recognized it too. Telemachus, trying not to show how much that simple statement had hit him, managed to hold his composure until he did not quite manage to hold it. And then he pulled his cloak over his face and wept. Helen, who had lived through things that required an uncommon kind of self-possession to survive, added something to the wine that the ancient storytellers described as a drug from Egypt. something that dulled pain and grief and allowed people to speak of hard things without being destroyed by them. And then she told her own story of the war, and Menelaus told his, and eventually the conversation came around to what Telemachus had actually come to ask. What had happened to Odysseus? Menelaus had his own strange tale to tell. On his way home from Troy, his ships had been becalmed for 20 days on an island off the coast of Egypt, trapped by weather with no wind and dwindling supplies. He had been desperate enough to do something that ordinary mortals almost never did. He had ambushed a god. Not a great Olympian god, a minor one, a creature of the sea called Proteus, the old man of the sea, who could change his shape at will, and who knew all things past and present and future. Menelaus had held him while he transformed from seal to lion to serpent to running water to blazing fire, and had not let go, holding on through every change until Proteus finally stopped fighting and agreed to answer questions. Among the things Proteus had told him was the fate of Odysseus, alive, the old sea god had said. Alive and trapped on an island in the middle of the sea, held there by a goddess who loved him, weeping on the shore every day, unable to leave. Telemachus absorbed this in silence. His father was alive. That was the central fact. Whatever else was complicated or uncertain or frightening, his father was alive. He thanked Menelaus and Helen. He accepted the gifts they pressed on him. And he prepared to return to Ithaca. He did not know yet that the suitors who had discovered his absence were planning to intercept his ship on the way back and kill him before he reached the harbour. He did not know about a great many things that were about to happen, but he knew his father was alive, and that changed everything. Let us go now to the island where Odysseus had been kept for 7 years. Ogygia was beautiful, in the way that certain places are beautiful, when they are exactly right in every physical detail and entirely wrong in every other way. The island rose from the sea in layers of forested hillside and wild meadow, cypress trees and alder and sweet-smelling poplar. 4 clear springs rising from the ground and flowing in different directions through grass, where violets and wild parsley grew in the shadows. At the heart of the island was a cave, not a dark cave. A cave transformed into something extraordinary by the woman who lived there. Her name was Calypso. She was a nymph, the daughter of Atlas who held up the sky. One of the minor divine beings of the ancient Greek world, who were not exactly gods, but were not mortal either. She was beautiful in the way that immortal beings are beautiful, which is differently from the way mortals are beautiful. Something more like a force of nature than a person. Her voice when she sang could charm the weather into stillness. Her cave was hung with grapevines and lit by some internal light that had nothing to do with fire. She had found Odysseus washed up on her shore years earlier, the sole survivor of a shipwreck, barely alive. She had nursed him back to health. She had fed him ambrosia and nectar, the food of the gods, which had healed him faster than any mortal medicine could have. She had fallen completely and genuinely in love with him. She had offered him the thing that all mortals secretly dream of, and almost none of them would actually want if they thought it through: immortality. "Stay with me," she said. "You will never age. You will never die. We will live here together forever in this beautiful place." Odysseus had said no. He said it every day, not unkindly. He acknowledged that Calypso was more beautiful than Penelope. He acknowledged that Ogygia was more beautiful than Ithaca. He acknowledged that immortality was a gift no mortal had ever been offered before. And then he said that he wanted to go home. Every day he sat on the rocks at the water's edge and stared east and wept, not because he was unhappy in any simple way, but because he was Odysseus and home meant something to him that could not be replaced by paradise. It meant Penelope. It meant Telemachus. It meant the specific smell of his own house, and the weight of his own kingdom, and the life that was his, and no one else's. 7 years of this. 7 years of the most beautiful prison that had ever existed. And then Hermes arrived. Hermes was the messenger of the gods, the one who moved between worlds with easy grace, carrying the will of Zeus to wherever it needed to go. He found Calypso in her cave, weaving at a golden loom, her voice filling the island with a song that made the air itself seem more alive. She offered him wine and food, because even immortal beings observed the laws of hospitality with each other. And then he delivered his message. Zeus had decided Odysseus was to be released. Calypso was to help him build a raft. She was to provision him for the journey, and she was to let him go. Her response was the response of someone who has been told they must give up the thing they love most, and who is not remotely surprised that the universe has arranged to take it from her. She was not angry, exactly. She was resigned in the way that people are resigned, when they have always known something could not last, and the something has simply stopped lasting. "You gods are impossible," she said. "You cannot bear to see a goddess in love with a mortal man. You burn their lovers with thunderbolts. You drown them, you take them away, but I hear you. I will do what Zeus commands." When Hermes left, Calypso went to find Odysseus at the shore. She found him exactly where she always found him, sitting on his rock, looking east. She told him he was free. She told him she would help him build a raft and teach him to navigate by the stars and send him off with provisions for the journey. Odysseus looked at her with eyes that had been looking at the horizon for 7 years and said very carefully, "Are you sure this is not a trick?" Calypso almost laughed. She swore her oath by the river Styx, the one oath that even immortals cannot break without consequences too terrible to contemplate. He believed her, and something in his face changed for the first time in years. He built the raft in 4 days. He had good tools, the kind of axes and adzes and drills that Calypso produced for him from her stores. And he had the skills of a man who had built things with his hands before the war took him away from ordinary life. 20 large trees, alders and poplars and firs, cut and shaped and fitted together with the precision of a man who understood that his life depended on the result, a mast, a rudder. Woven branches for the sides to keep the waves from washing over the deck. On the 5th day, Calypso loaded it with provisions, skins of dark wine and fresh water, bags of grain and dried meat. She gave him clean clothing, and then, that evening, she sat with him and taught him the stars. "Keep the bear always on your left," she said. Pointing up at the constellation, the Greeks called the bear, and we call the Big Dipper sail, for 17 days, and on the 18th you will see mountains on the horizon. That will be the land of the Phaeacians. Who will help you get home? She paused. She looked at him the way people look at things they are about to lose. "If you knew what lay between here and home," she said quietly, "you might choose to stay." "I know you will not," she said before he could respond. "That is who you are." When morning came, Odysseus pushed his raft into the sea. He stood on the deck and felt the wind fill the small square sail he had rigged. Behind him, Calypso stood on the shore and watched until he was small enough that she could pretend briefly that he was simply a dark shape on the water, and not a man she would never see again. 17 days. 17 days of open sea, with nothing but the stars and the wind and the raft, and his own thoughts for company. On the 17th day he could see mountains. The island of the Phaeacians was there on the horizon. Blue-grey in the distance, real and solid. He was going to make it. And then Poseidon came home. The god of the seas had been away from Olympus, feasting at the edge of the world, which was why Zeus had been able to set all of this in motion without interference. But now Poseidon was returning. He was crossing the sky in his chariot, as gods travelled when they were not in their proper domain. And he happened to look down. He saw the raft. He saw Odysseus. And the anger that had been simmering for years came back to full boil. So he said, "The other gods have been busy while I was away." His voice, when he was angry, was the voice of earthquakes. He would not let him reach home safely. That was clear. Zeus had apparently decreed it. But Zeus had not said it had to be easy. Poseidon raised his trident and called the winds, all of them, from every direction at once. What happened to the raft in the next few minutes was what happens to small wooden things when the sea becomes genuinely angry. The winds collided over the raft and created walls of water that came from everywhere simultaneously. The mast snapped, the sail tore away. A wave that was bigger than anything Odysseus had ever seen picked him up and flung him into the sea. He went under. He fought back up. His hands found a piece of the broken raft, and he held on. The storm lasted 2 days. 2 days of being thrown and submerged and finding the surface and being thrown again. His hands were bleeding from clinging to the wood. His eyes burned from the salt water. His body was doing what bodies do when they have been pushed to the absolute limit of what they can sustain. It was a sea goddess who saved him. Her name was Ino, and she had once been mortal, which perhaps was why she had more sympathy for mortals in distress than some of the other divine beings. She rose from the water in the form of a seabird and settled on the wreckage beside him. She gave him a veil. Not an ordinary veil, an immortal one, something woven from divine materials that would keep him afloat no matter what the sea did to him. "Tie this around your chest," she said. "Swim for the shore. When you reach land, throw it back into the sea," and then she was gone. He tied the veil and he swam. For 2 days he swam in the remains of the storm, which faded gradually as Poseidon's immediate fury spent itself, leaving behind a heavy swell that was difficult but survivable. On the 3rd morning, he could see a coastline, not the welcoming kind of coastline. The kind made entirely of cliffs and rocks and surf, crashing against them with a sound like the world ending. For hours he swam parallel to the coast, looking for any place he could land. The waves threw him toward the rocks, and he grabbed them, and the rocks tore his hands, and another wave pulled him back before he could find a grip. He prayed. He prayed to the river god of whatever river might run into this sea, and the current shifted, just enough. He found the mouth of a river. He swam in against the current, asking the river god to have mercy, and the current gentled. He dragged himself out onto the bank. He untied the divine veil and threw it back into the water as Ino had instructed. And then he lay on the muddy bank of a river, on an island he did not recognize, and breathed. Just breathed. The sheer animal relief of being alive and not moving was overwhelming. He crawled into a grove of olive trees. He covered himself with fallen leaves until he was buried in them, and he slept. The island was called Scheria. Its people were called the Phaeacians. They were a remarkable people who lived close to the gods, and who were famous above all else for their ships and their sailors. Their ships, it was said, did not need to be steered. They knew the minds of their crews, and went where they were meant to go without being directed. Their sailors could cross any sea in any weather, and arrive at any destination they set out for. They were, in short, exactly the kind of people that Odysseus desperately needed to find. While Odysseus lay buried in his pile of leaves, the goddess Athena was busy on his behalf. She came to the island in the night and found the princess. Her name was Nausicaa. She was the daughter of the king and queen of the Phaeacians, a young woman of exceptional composure, who was by all accounts on the verge of marriage without having found anyone she particularly wanted to marry. Athena came to her in a dream in the form of one of her friends. The dream Nausicaa dreamed was practical. The kind of practical that goddesses who wanted things accomplished preferred. She should go to the river tomorrow, the dream friend said. She should take the household laundry. There was a lot of it, and it needed washing, and a princess could not expect to find a husband if the household linens were not clean. When morning came, Nausicaa woke with the absolute conviction that she needed to do laundry that day. She gathered her handmaidens, and they loaded a mule cart with everything that needed washing and drove it to the river. They washed the laundry in the stone basins by the water. They spread it on the rocks to dry in the sun. They ate their lunch, and then they played. They threw a ball back and forth in the warm afternoon light and sang and laughed in the way that young women do when the work is done and no one is watching. One of Nausicaa's throws went wide. The ball splashed into the shallow water at the edge of the river. The girls shrieked and laughed, their voices carried. In the olive grove nearby, something stirred under a pile of leaves. Odysseus emerged from the leaves the way people emerge from extreme situations, not at his best. He was salt-crusted and bruised and covered in dried mud, and his hair was matted from 2 days in the sea, and he was holding a leafy branch across himself because he had no clothing. He looked, in short, like exactly what he was, a man who had been through something extraordinary and had arrived on the other side of it, barely intact. The handmaidens took one look at him and scattered, all except Nausicaa. She stood her ground. Odysseus stayed carefully at a distance and spoke to her with the exact right words, which were not an accident. He was good at finding the exact right words. He told her she was like a tree he had once seen at a sacred place, a palm tree rising from the earth with such grace and beauty that it had stopped him in his tracks. He asked for her help. He acknowledged his situation without shame. He asked for clothing and for directions to the city. He called down the blessings of the gods on whatever husband she eventually chose. Nausicaa called her handmaidens back. She told them this was a stranger in need, that strangers in need were under the protection of Zeus, and that they were going to help him. They brought him clothing and olive oil to wash himself with. They showed him where the river ran clear, and left him to clean himself, while they waited at a respectful distance. When he emerged, clean and dressed, Athena did something subtle and useful. She adjusted the way he appeared, not a disguise, just the difference between a man at his worst and the same man at his best. His hair settled properly. His shoulders straightened. Something about him resolved into the person he actually was, which was a king and a hero who happened to have recently been through a great deal. Nausicaa looked at him and thought something she was too composed to say out loud. She fed him and her handmaidens, and then she led the way toward the city, giving Odysseus careful instructions about how to approach without embarrassing her. "Wait in the grove of Athena outside the city," she said. "Let me go ahead. We are a proud people, and they will gossip if they see me arriving home with a strange man. When you have given me enough time to reach the palace, come in and ask anyone to direct you to my mother's house. Find my mother. Her name is Arete. Clasp her knees as a suppliant. If she looks on you with kindness, you will get home." Odysseus waited in the grove of Athena and prayed. Athena came to him there, disguised as a young girl carrying a water jar, and she wrapped him in a mist so that he could walk through the city without being seen, because she understood that he needed to reach the queen without being intercepted. The palace of the Phaeacian king Alcinous was magnificent in ways that made Odysseus, who had been to Troy and seen the palaces of many kings, stop at the threshold and simply look. Bronze walls from floor to ceiling, gold and silver doorposts, a frieze of blue enamel, doors of gold, golden dogs and silver dogs flanking the entrance, made by the divine craftsman Hephaestus himself, so perfectly made that they were ageless and immortal. Inside, 50 serving women working at their tasks. Outside, an orchard that bore fruit in every season because the gods had blessed it with perpetual abundance. Odysseus walked through all of it in Athena's mist, unseen, until he reached the hearth where Queen Arete sat spinning in the firelight. He let the mist fall. He crossed the room. He knelt and clasped her knees. And the room went completely silent. The Phaeacians were not the kind of people who saw strangers appear from nowhere in their great hall very often. There was a long silence in which everyone present processed what had just happened. Then one of the oldest nobles, a man who had the particular authority of someone who had seen enough to know when the moment called for tradition rather than reaction, suggested that the stranger be given a seat and food and wine. Whatever else was going on, he was a suppliant, and suppliants were protected. King Alcinous stood and raised Odysseus himself and seated him beside him in a chair of honor and called for a meal. They fed him. They did not ask his name. Not yet. There would be time for that. When the meal was done, Alcinous spoke. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will feast properly and arrange to send you home, wherever home is. Our ships can reach any shore in a single night. Our sailors are the finest in the world. Whoever you are, whatever brought you to our island, you will go home." The next day brought feasting and games. The Phaeacians loved competition, athletic events, in which the young men of the court tested themselves against each other, and against any visitor who was willing. They assumed reasonably that the ragged stranger who had appeared at their queen's feet the night before was not a competitive threat. They were wrong. One of the younger men made the mistake of insulting Odysseus, suggesting that he was the merchant type and not much of an athlete. Odysseus picked up a discus that was heavier than the ones the Phaeacians had been throwing, and threw it considerably farther than any of them had managed. He did not particularly enjoy doing it. He had not come here to compete, but he was Odysseus, and certain kinds of provocation he simply could not leave unanswered. The Phaeacians took this in good spirit. Alcinous called for dancing instead, and the young men of the court performed with the kind of athletic grace that made it clear why these people were so good at sailing. They were simply comfortable in their bodies, in the way that people are when physical skill is something they have been developing since childhood. There was a blind bard named Demodocus. He was the court poet, the man who sang the stories that preserved the past and entertained the present. The Muses had taken his sight and given him the gift of song in exchange, which the ancient Greeks seemed to believe was a fair trade, or at least a recognizable one. Demodocus sang of the Trojan War. He sang a specific episode, a famous quarrel between Achilles and Odysseus, one that had apparently happened and been preserved in the tradition. The Phaeacian court was delighted by the song. The stranger at the table of honor pulled his cloak over his head. When Alcinous noticed that his guest was weeping, he called for a pause in the music. He did not embarrass the stranger by commenting on the tears directly. He simply changed the subject. More wine, more food, more games. He suggested they try the more joyful kinds of athletic contest. But he also said quietly that it might be time for their guest to tell them who he was and where he came from. And so, with the whole Phaeacian court listening by torchlight, Odysseus began to talk. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes," he said, "a man known for cleverness throughout the world. My home is Ithaca, a low island but beautiful in its own way, a place that I have been trying to get back to for 10 years. He paused. "You asked for my story. I will tell it, all of it." He looked around the silent room. "It began the day we left Troy. Rest here for a moment. Let yourself settle deeper into the dark. Let the warmth around you be the warmth of a great hall lit by torches, the Phaeacians listening in perfect silence, wine in their cups, night outside the windows, a man beginning to tell his story. You are here, in this ancient hall, in this ancient night, and the story has only just begun. Breathe slowly. Let everything go quiet. We are listening the way the Phaeacians listened, in the soft dark, without hurry, without anywhere else to be. When Odysseus began his account of the years after Troy, he started with the most painful kind of truth. The beginning of his journey home was his own fault, not entirely, but partly. And Odysseus, who had spent a lifetime being honest about inconvenient things because cleverness without self-knowledge is just sophistication without wisdom, told the story accurately. Leaving Troy, 12 ships and their crews had sailed northwest along the coast toward home. They should have kept sailing, but they made a stop, the Cicones. The Cicones were a Thracian people who lived on the northern coast, and they had fought on the Trojan side. Odysseus and his men raided their city of Ismara. This was not unusual behavior for the time and place. War involved raids. Raids involved taking what was useful and leaving. Odysseus took what was useful and then told his men to leave immediately. His men did not leave immediately. They had survived 10 years of war. There was wine on this beach and meat, and the feeling of victory. They feasted and drank all night. By morning, the Sicans who had escaped the initial raid had called in their allies from inland. They came with horses and with numbers that vastly exceeded the Greeks on the beach. The battle that followed was bad. 6 men from each ship died on that beach. 72 men who had survived Troy died because Odysseus's crew would not listen to him when he said it was time to go. They made their escape in the ships with the Cyclone warriors standing in the surf and launching arrows after them. They held the proper mourning rituals at sea, calling the names of the dead 3 times over the water. And then a storm hit them, not just a bad storm, the kind of storm that Zeus sends when he is in the mood to redirect the plans of mortal men. 2 days of it, the sails destroyed, the crew bailing water constantly. Finally, sheltering on a beach on the Cape of Malea at the southern tip of Greece. They were close to home. From Malea, you could see the outline of the Peloponnese on a clear day. But the wind turned and pushed them south and then west, and they sailed for 9 days in the wrong direction. 9 days, away from home, into waters none of them had ever sailed. On the 10th day, they reached land. The island of the Lotus Eaters. Odysseus sent 3 men ahead to find out what kind of people lived there. The island was quiet and peaceful and beautiful in a way that should perhaps have been suspicious. The people who came out to meet the scouts were gentle, friendly. They offered food. The food they offered was the lotus, the plant that grew on this island, and that gave its name to its people. It looked like a flower. It tasted, the ancient storytellers suggested, like sweet honey. And it did something to the mind that had nothing to do with physical pleasure. It took away desire. Specifically the desire to go home. The 3 scouts ate the lotus and sat down. They were not distressed. They were not sick. They were perfectly content. They simply no longer had any interest in going back to the ships, or sailing back to Greece, or seeing their families again. They sat there in the gentle sunshine of the island of the Lotus Eaters and wanted nothing. When Odysseus found them, he had to drag them physically to the ships. They wept as he pulled them, not from pain, from the loss of a contentment so complete that going home felt like being torn away from paradise. He got them back to the ships and told the rest of the crew not to eat anything offered by the people on the beach. They pushed off immediately and sailed away from an island where forgetting was the greatest kindness anyone had ever been offered, and where the men who had tasted it had to be forcibly removed from their own peace. They came next to an island that was wild and untended in a way that suggested no human hand had touched it for a very long time. Rich with wild goats and heavy timber, and streams running fresh from the hills down to the sea, the kind of island that would have been extraordinary farmland if anyone had ever gotten around to farming it. Across a narrow stretch of water from this island, they could see the mainland coast and the smoke of fires, and they could hear, drifting across the water, a sound that was nothing like the sounds that normal people made, a bass rumble, not a voice exactly, not anything recognizably human. They camped on the first island that night, and in the morning Odysseus took his own ship across to investigate. He left the other 11 ships safely anchored and took only one. This decision would matter later. They found a cave, not a small cave, a cave whose entrance was large enough to drive sheep through, which was how Odysseus knew immediately that whoever lived here kept sheep inside. Pens of lambs, organized by age. Pails full of cream. Wheels of cheese stacked against the walls, each one the size of a man. More cheese than Odysseus had seen in one place in his life. The crew wanted to take the cheese and the lambs and go back to the ships immediately. This was the logical choice. This was the correct choice. Odysseus did not make it. He wanted to see who lived here. He was curious. It was one of his qualities. It would cost him enormously. They waited. At evening, the owner came home. He was not a man. Or rather, he was shaped like a man the way a boulder is shaped like a ball, approximately and at great scale. He was a Cyclops, one of the ancient race of one-eyed giants who lived apart from the gods and from ordinary humanity, and who made their own rules because no one was large enough to make rules for them. His name was Polyphemus. He was the son of Poseidon. This was information that would have been useful to have earlier. He came into his cave with a load of wood so large that when he dropped it, it shook the ground. He drove his flock in behind him. He rolled a stone across the entrance of the cave. The stone was not a boulder. The stone was a cliff face. 20 teams of oxen could not have moved it. The Greeks, who had not yet been noticed, pressed themselves against the wall of the cave and tried to be very still and very small. Polyphemus lit his fire. The cave filled with light. He saw them. His one eye, the size of a cartwheel, moved across the small group of men pressed against the wall. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was a landslide. Odysseus stepped forward. He was afraid, but he was Odysseus, and fear had never stopped his mouth from working. He said they were Greeks, soldiers returning from Troy, and that they came as suppliants under the protection of Zeus, who watched over travellers. Polyphemus said he did not care about Zeus. His people, the Cyclopes, were stronger than the gods and feared nothing. He asked where the ship was. Odysseus said the ship had been destroyed by Poseidon. This was a lie. A successful one. Polyphemus said nothing for a moment. Then he reached into the group of men. With 2 hands he picked up 2 of them, the way a man might pick up 2 puppies, and he killed them and ate them. There is no gentle way to say this. He killed them and ate them while the others watched. He drank a bucket of milk and went to sleep. Odysseus had his sword. He considered briefly the possibility of killing the giant while he slept. And then he considered the stone across the entrance of the cave, which no number of men currently present could move. He put his sword away. They waited for morning. In the morning, Polyphemus ate 2 more men for breakfast and drove his flock out and rolled the stone back across the entrance, sealing them inside. He went to pasture his sheep in the cave, Odysseus thought. His mind, which was his greatest resource, went to work on a problem that could not be solved with strength and could not be solved with weapons and could not be solved by moving the stone, and which had to be solved because everyone in this cave who was still alive was going to be eaten if it was not. He found a length of olive wood in the cave. It was as tall as a ship's mast. It was Polyphemus's walking stick. He cut a section from it and sharpened one end with his sword and hardened it in the fire until the tip glowed red. He hid it under the dung that covered the cave floor. He found in the Cyclops' stores a great bowl of wine, dark wine, thick and strong. He waited. That evening, Polyphemus came home and ate 2 more men. Odysseus stepped forward. He offered the giant wine. Polyphemus drank it. His single eye widened at the taste. He had never had wine this strong. He asked for more. Odysseus gave him more, the giant, whose scale made even this quantity of strong wine manageable for a while, asked his guest's name. "My name," Odysseus said, "is nobody. That is what my mother calls me, and what my father calls me, and what all my friends call me, nobody." Polyphemus laughed the way only very large beings can laugh, from somewhere deep in the earth. "Then here is my gift to you. Nobody," he said. "I will eat you last." He found this generous. He fell asleep in the middle of his own laughter. Odysseus took the sharpened stake from the dung. He put the tip in the fire until it glowed. He called his 4 best men. They lifted the stake together and drove it into Polyphemus's eye. The sound it made was the sound of a smith plunging hot metal into cold water. Polyphemus's scream shook the cave. He wrenched the stake out of his ruined eye and lurched around the cave, blind, searching for the men by sound and smell. They flattened themselves against the walls. Other Cyclopes came from outside. They called in through the stone. "Polyphemus," they shouted, "are you being hurt by someone?" Polyphemus roared back, "Nobody is hurting me." There was a brief silence from outside. "Well," the other Cyclope said, "if nobody is hurting you, then you must be sick and Zeus sent it, and there is nothing we can do." And they went back to their caves. Akla was still the problem. The stone was still immovable. But in the morning the stone had to move. The flock had to go out to pasture. And Odysseus had been watching the flock all night. He told his men what they were going to do. Each man tied himself to the underside of one of the large rams, not on top where the Cyclops would feel them when he ran his hands over the animals' backs as they went out. Underneath, gripping the thick wool, legs wrapped around the animal's belly, face against the warm skin, Odysseus saved the largest ram for himself. Dawn came. Polyphemus rolled back the stone and crouched in the entrance, feeling the backs and sides of each animal as it passed, making sure no one escaped riding on a sheep. The plan worked because it was the kind of plan that required the adversary to be unable to imagine it. A blind man feels what is there. He cannot feel what is not there, which is a man hanging underneath a sheep where no man would think to hang. One by one the rams passed the blind giant with the men underneath them. Odysseus went last under the largest ram. As he passed through the entrance of the cave into the daylight, he heard Polyphemus speak to his favourite ram, his voice soft in a way it had never been with the humans. He was wondering why his best ram was moving slowly today. He missed his eye. He talked to the ram the way lonely people talk to the animals they love. Odysseus, clinging to the wall with bleeding hands, did not let go. They ran. They got the rams onto the ship. They pushed off, they rowed. And then, because he was Odysseus and because some part of him could not leave without saying what was true, he shouted back at the receding shore. He told the Cyclops that it was not nobody who had done this to him. He told the Cyclops his name, Odysseus, son of Laertes from Ithaca. His men begged him to stop. He did not stop. Polyphemus hurled boulders in the direction of the voice. The boulders nearly capsized the ship, and then the Cyclops knelt at the water's edge and prayed to his father Poseidon. He asked his father to make sure that if Odysseus made it home, he arrived late and alone and miserable to find nothing but grief waiting for him. Poseidon heard the prayer. From that moment, the sea itself became an active participant in Odysseus's troubles. Let the story rest here for a while. Let yourself rest. You have been sailing all night with Odysseus through his account of those early disasters, and you deserve the same thing he was looking for every time he reached ashore, just a moment of stillness. Just the warmth of wherever you are. Just the quiet. The king of the winds was named Aeolus. He lived on a floating island with walls of bronze, and he and his 12 children, 6 sons and 6 daughters who had married each other, lived there in permanent celebration, feasting every day on meat so plentiful that the smoke from the fires was visible from a distance. Odysseus stayed there for a month. Aeolus was generous and curious, and enjoyed the stories of Troy enormously. When the month was over and Odysseus asked to continue home, Aeolus gave him an extraordinary gift. He took the skin of a full-grown ox, and inside it he sealed every wind except the west wind, every wind that could blow a ship off course, all of them trapped inside one ox skin sealed with silver wire. Only the west wind was left free to push them home. He tied the bag himself and gave it to Odysseus and told him on no account to open it until he was on the shores of Ithaca. Odysseus kept it at his station at the helm and did not sleep. For 9 days and 9 nights he steered and watched and did not let anyone else near the bag. On the 10th day, Ithaca was visible. He could see the fires on the shore. He was home. He had been awake for 9 days, and he allowed himself for the first time to sleep. His men, who had been watching him guard that bag for 9 days, began to talk among themselves. What was in it? It must be gold. It must be silver. All the wealth of the places they had been. And he was going to keep it for himself, while they who had suffered equally got nothing. They opened the bag. Every wind imprisoned inside exploded out simultaneously. The ships were caught in a hurricane of conflicting winds from every direction at once. They spun, the sails tore, the sea went vertical. When it was over, they were back where they had started, back at the floating island of Aeolus. Odysseus went back to the king and explained what had happened. He asked for help again. Aeolus looked at him. There was no help, he said. A man this clearly cursed by the gods was not something any reasonable divine being wanted to involve themselves with. Leave the island, Aeolus said. I cannot help someone the gods want to destroy, the Lastrygonians. This is the part of the story that is hardest to tell with any comfort. They sailed 6 days and came to a harbour. The harbour seemed perfect, perfectly circular, enclosed by cliffs on every side with only one narrow entrance. Calm water, the 11 other ships went in Odysseus, on his own ship, stopped at the entrance and tied up to a rock there instead of going in with the others. Something about the harbour made him uneasy. He could not have explained what. An instinct. The same instinct that keeps clever people alive in situations where clever people sometimes are the only ones who survive. 3 scouts went ashore to find out about the people here. They met a girl drawing water from a well. She was very tall. She directed them to her father's house. Her father was the king of the Lastrygonians, and he was the size of a mountain. He grabbed one of the scouts immediately. The other 2 ran. Behind them, the Lastrygonians gathered. Not one giant, many. A whole race of them, massive and fast and hungry. They came to the cliff tops above the harbour. They threw boulders, not at the ships, at the men inside them. Then they speared the survivors in the water like fish. In the perfect closed harbour, with its single narrow entrance, there was nowhere to go. 11 ships, their crews, goner Odysseus cut his mooring rope. His ship, alone outside the harbour, was the only one left. His crew rowed until their arms gave out, and they could no longer hear the sounds from behind them. They sat in silence on the ship for a very long time. They came to an island. They rested on the shore for 2 days. Not from exhaustion only, but from something that is harder to name. The weight of what had happened. The 11 ships were gone. The hundreds of men who had sailed with them from Troy were gone. They were one ship now, and they had come home from the war to find themselves, somehow, still in the worst part of it. On the 3rd day, Odysseus climbed a hill and looked at the island. He could see smoke rising from somewhere in the trees. He went back to the crew and divided them in 2, and had them draw lots to see who would go investigate. He was one group. His lieutenant Eurylochus led the other. Eurylochus's group went. They found a stone house in the middle of the woods. Around it, wolves and mountain lions. But they were not frightening. They were tame, gentle. They approached the men like dogs that wanted to be petted. From inside the house came a woman's voice, singing. She was at a loom, and her voice was doing something to the air, making it denser and more pleasant, the way certain kinds of music do. All of Eurylochus's men went inside, except Eurylochus himself. Something stopped him at the door. Inside, the woman gave them food and wine. She moved among them while they ate, and into each cup she added something, and she touched each man with her wand. They became pigs. They kept their minds. That was the cruelest part, that they retained their human consciousness in animal bodies, understanding perfectly what had happened to them and unable to do anything about it. She drove them to a sty and penned them. Eurylochus ran back to the ship and told Odysseus, barely coherent with horror. The woman's name was Circe. She was not mortal. She was the daughter of Helios, the sun itself. And she had lived on this island called Aea for longer than human memory reached. and she would live there long after human memory forgot it. Odysseus started walking toward her house. On the way, a young man stepped into his path. The young man was Hermes, the messenger of the gods, who had come to help not out of pure altruism, out of something more complicated that may have included the fact that Odysseus was one of the more interesting mortals currently alive, and his dying in a pigsty on a witch's island would be a waste. Hermes gave him an herb, white flower, black root, called moly. The gods could pull it from the earth. Mortals could not. Eat this before you eat anything she gives you, Hermes said. Her potion will not work. When she touches you with her wand, and nothing happens, draw your sword, rush at her as if you mean to kill her. She will step back and offer to share her bed. Do not refuse her, but make her swear the oath of the gods first. The oath by the river sticks that she means you no harm. Then trust her. She has something to offer you that you need. He vanished. Odysseus kept walking. It went exactly as Hermes had described. Circe fed him. She added her drug. She touched him with her wand. Nothing happened. She was genuinely surprised. Odysseus drew his sword. She stepped back. She looked at him with something that was not quite fear, but was not quite not fear either. She said, "You must be Odysseus. Hermes always said you would come here one day." She swore her oath. He put his sword away, and something shifted between them. Not warmth, exactly, but recognition. Two beings who were both extraordinary in their own ways, and who could see that in each other. She restored his men. She brought them out of the pig pens and touched them with the other side of her wand, and they were themselves again, themselves, and somehow younger, and more whole than they had been before. As if the transformation had stripped away some of the damage of the years and left something cleaner. They stayed on Aea for a year. The crew needed it. After Troy and the Ciconians and the Lotus Eaters and the Cyclops and the Lestrygonians, after everything they had lost and survived and witnessed, there was simply a need to stop. To eat well and sleep well and be somewhere that was neither a battlefield nor a sea voyage. Circe's island offered this, and she offered it freely. Odysseus spent the year as her guest, which was more than her guest. He was, for that time, the person she was closest to, which for an immortal being means something more complicated than it does for humans. But when the year was over, when the crew came to him one morning and said, gently, that they wanted to go home, that they had been away long enough, he went to Circe. He asked to leave. She did not refuse. But she told him the truth about what lay ahead. Before you can go home, she said, you must go somewhere else first. You must go to the land of the dead. You must speak with the prophet Tiresias. He is the only one who can tell you how to get home, the land of the dead. The ancient Greeks called it Hades. Not hell in the way later traditions would imagine it. Not a place of punishment, exactly. Though there were punishments happening there for those who had particularly offended the gods. Just the place where everyone eventually went. The grey land at the edge of the world where the rivers of the underworld ran. The Styx and the Acheron and the Phlegethon and the rest, where the shades of the dead flitted like pale smoke through meadows of asphodel. No one alive was supposed to go there. Circe gave Odysseus precise instructions, the direction to sail, what to do when he arrived, the sacrifice to make, the words to say. And she warned him about what he would see there. The shades of the dead needed blood to speak. They were pale and without memory until they drank from the pit. He would dig and fill with blood from the sacrifice. He would need to control who approached. He would need to wait for Tiresias. Others wouldn't come first, people he knew. He needed to be ready. They sailed north and west through thick fog into waters that no ship from Greece had ever entered. The sun disappeared. The sky went dark at noon. Not storm dark, something else. The kind of dark that suggests you have sailed past the edge of the ordinary world. They reached the shore that Circe had described, a beach at the edge of the grove of Persephone, the trees black poplar and willow. Odysseus dug the pit. He said the words Circe had taught him. He sacrificed the animals and let the blood fill the pit. And they came. The dead arrived the way darkness arrives, not all at once. First the edges of things changed, and then more and more of them, until there were so many that the air was full of their sound. Not voices exactly, more like the idea of voices. The memory of speech preserved in forms that no longer had bodies to produce sound with. Brides, and young men, and old men who had died of age, and girls who had died young, and warriors who still bore the marks of the wounds that had killed them. Odysseus held his sword. He kept them back from the pit. He waited. The first shade he recognized was someone he had not expected, a young man from his own crew named Elpenor, who had died on Circe's island. He had climbed to the roof of Circe's house the night before they left, drunk, and fallen off in the morning and broken his neck. They had not buried him. In the urgency of their departure, they had simply left. Elpenor's shade came to him in distress, asking for burial, asking for the proper rites that the Greeks believed were necessary for the dead to rest. Odysseus promised. He would go back to Circe's island on the way home and bury him properly. The shade of Elpenor retreated somewhat comforted. Then came his mother. He had not known she was dead. He had left her alive when he went to Troy. Here she was among the shades, her face pale insubstantial. He held her back from the pit. He could not let her drink yet. He needed Tiresias first. It was one of the harder things he did on this journey, keeping his mother away from the blood that would let her speak to him, watching her shade flutter at the edge of the pit while he waited. Tiresias came. Even here, even dead, the old prophet had a presence. He had been blind in life, and had apparently not been given eyes in death either. But he moved through the crowd of shades with the confidence of a man who sees by other means. He drank from the pit, he spoke. What the prophet told Odysseus was a map of what was still to come. There would be more dangers. There would be the cattle of the sun god Helios, sacred animals on the island of Thrinacia, that must not be touched. If his crew touched them, they would all die, and he would come home alone and broken. There were the Sirens, whose song would kill anyone who heard it not unprepared. There were Scylla and Charybdis, the monster and the whirlpool. There was the suitor problem waiting at home, which would require violence and cunning to resolve. And even after all of that, Tiresias said, even when Odysseus was home and the suitors were dealt with, there was still more, a final journey inland with an oar on his shoulder, until he reached people who had never seen the sea and did not know what an oar was. There he would plant the oar in the earth as an offering to Poseidon. Only then would the god's anger be finally appeased. Only then would Odysseus die peacefully at home of old age, surrounded by people who were happy. It was, as prophecies go, not terrible. There was an ending. The ending was good. But it was a long way off still. He let his mother drink from the pit. She knew him immediately. She told him of home. Penelope was still faithful, still waiting. Telemachus was grown and well. His father Laertes was alive but grief-stricken, living simply on the farm and refusing ordinary pleasures because his son had not come home. As for herself, she said, she had not died of any illness. She had died of missing him. The Greeks believed that was possible. A person could simply stop living because the thing they were living for had been taken away. 3 times Odysseus tried to hold her. 3 times his arms passed through nothing. She was smoke and memory. The shape of her was there, but not the substance. She told him not to grieve. This was how it was for everyone who died. The body was gone. The sinews no longer held everything together. The soul was a shadow, a dream. He should go home. He should go back to the living. And he should remember her. More shades came, queens of the ancient world. Heroes he had known at Troy, Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek forces, murdered in his bath by his wife and her lover the moment he came home from the war, warning Odysseus not to trust women, his bitterness audible even through the paleness of his shade. Achilles, who had chosen a short glorious life over a long quiet one, who had died at Troy as he had always said he would, who told Odysseus now that he had been wrong. Better to be alive as the lowest slave to the poorest master than to be king among the dead. The life was the thing, just the being alive and feeling the sun was worth any amount of glory that ended. Ajax, who had died by his own hand after a contest over Achilles' armour, was awarded to Odysseus instead of him, who was still angry, who would not speak. He turned and walked away, and Odysseus watched him go and said, as much to himself as to the shade, I wish that contest had never happened. There were more, there were thousands more, and they were pressing forward, and the sound they made was building from a whisper to something more urgent, and Odysseus felt, looking at the crowd of them, the particular fear of someone who has come to a place where he does not belong, and who needs to leave before the place decides he belongs there after all. He went back to the ship. They rowed away from the shore of the dead as fast as they could. Back on Circe's island, they buried Elpenor. They built his mound on the headland above the sea and planted his oar at the top the way he had asked. Circe came to them on the beach in the morning with food and wine and warned Odysseus again of what was coming. She was more specific this time. She told him exactly what to do about each danger he would face. The Sirens and Charybdis, the cattle of the sun. She said what she needed to say, and then she said goodbye. She watched them push off from the shore, and she watched the sail fill with the wind she sent them, and she watched until the ship was a dark shape on the water that eventually disappeared, right here in the dark. Let the ancient sea rock the ship gently beneath you. Let the stars above be the stars that Odysseus navigated by, the same ones, unchanged. Let yourself drift, there is more story to come. But right now, in this quiet, in this ancient night, there is just the sound of the water, and the slow breathing of men who are tired and are sent towards something they hope is home. If you are still here, still listening, still somewhere in the comfortable dark with this story washing over you, then welcome back, or welcome for the first time, if this is where you found us. We are in the middle of the oldest journey in Western literature. Odysseus is on the sea. He has been to the land of the dead and come back. He has been warned about every danger still ahead of him. And now, in the ancient dark, the ship moves forward. Before we continue, if you have not already, please subscribe and drop a comment telling us where in the world you are listening from tonight. Are you in a warm bed with a fan running? Are you in a car on a long quiet road? Are you somewhere where morning is already coming through the curtains? Wherever you are part of something that has been happening for nearly 3,000 years. People listening to this story in the dark, let that settle around you, and let us continue. Circe had warned him about everything. She had told him the exact order of the dangers he would face, and what to do about each of them. She had been as precise and as thorough as it was possible to be. The first thing she had described was the Sirens. The Sirens lived on an island. They were women, or they had been women once, or they looked like women from a distance, which amounted to the same thing for sailors who never got close enough to see clearly. What they had, instead of ordinary humanity, was voices. Their voices were not beautiful in the way that a good singer is beautiful. They were beautiful in the way that the answer to a question you have been asking your whole life is beautiful. The Sirens sang of knowledge. They sang of everything that had happened at Troy, of the great deeds and the terrible losses, of the things men had done and the things done to them. They sang of all the things in the world that a curious person might want to know. And whoever heard them sailed toward the island and kept sailing toward it, and came closer and closer until their ship ran onto the rocks and they drowned. Not because they had been tricked, because they had wanted to hear more. The island was ringed with the bones of ships and the bones of the men who had sailed them. Circe had been specific about what to do. melt beeswax and plug the ears of every man in the crew. If Odysseus wanted to hear the song himself, and she knew he would want to, because she knew him, he could, but he had to be tied to the mast first. Tied tightly, and given the specific instruction that no matter what he said or did or commanded while the song was in his ears, no one was to untie him until the island was behind them. If he begged, ignore him. If he commanded, ignore him. If he seemed in pain, add more rope. They did exactly this. Odysseus stood at the mast while his men wrapped the wax into their ears and then tied him to the mast with thick rope. He had asked them to. He had told them to do it, and he had meant it. And now with his arms pinned at his sides and his back against the mast, he watched the island approach and waited. The song began before he expected it to. It came across the water, like something he had always known was there, and had never been able to hear clearly until this moment. He could not have described what it sounded like afterward. Every attempt to describe it would have been smaller than the thing itself. What he felt when he heard it was not pleasure, exactly. It was recognition. The Sirens sang his name. They sang of his cleverness, of the horse, of everything he had done. They sang of things they knew about the world that he did not know, secrets of the gods and the deep sea and the future, everything that a man who was made of curiosity would most want to hear. He pulled against the ropes. He did not know he was doing it at first. Then he knew and could not stop. He shouted at his men to untie him. His men, who could hear nothing, who saw only their captain shouting at them and struggling against his bindings, looked at each other, and then at the nearest officer. The nearest officer added more rope. Odysseus raged against the mast. The song continued. It did not care about the rage. It kept offering everything, and then the island was behind them. The song faded the way dreams fade when you wake. Not all at once, by degrees. First the specific words, then the general sense, then just the quality of it, the feeling of having been offered something extraordinary and having it taken back. His men removed the wax from their ears and untied him. He stood at the mast for a while without moving. He did not speak for some time. Circe had told him about the next choice. It was not really a choice. A choice implies that both options are survivable. On one side of the narrow strait was Charybdis. On the other side was Scylla. Charybdis was a whirlpool, not an ordinary whirlpool. The kind that came from the breath of something old and deep and hungry that lived below the surface and inhaled and exhaled on a rhythm that had nothing to do with human time. 3 times a day, Charybdis sucked the sea down to the bedrock. The water went. The exposed seafloor was briefly visible, black and ancient and never meant to be seen. And then the whirlpool spat it all back up in a roiling column of salt water and foam. Any ship caught in that pull, when the breath came in, was gone. Not damaged. Going the water on the other side was calmer. Scylla lived in the cliff face on that side. She had 6 heads on long necks that could reach down to the sea's surface. Each head had 3 rows of teeth, and she ate whatever came within reach. 6 heads. 6 men per pass. That was the arithmetic of the strait. Circe had told him the truth about this, and the truth was not comfortable. Go towards Scylla, she had said. Do not fight her. Do not try to arm yourself against her. Do not waste time. You will lose 6 men. 6 men is survivable. Charybdis is not. She had also told him not to tell the crew. Odysseus told the crew about Charybdis. He told them to keep to the right of the strait and row hard. He did not tell them about Scylla. He stood in the prow with his armour on and his spears in hand, because that was the kind of man he was. The kind who put on his armour, even when he had been told there was nothing he could do. When the strait narrowed, and the sound of Charybdis became audible on the left. A roaring below roaring sound like nothing else in the natural world. The crew naturally looked left. Odysseus was watching the right cliff. He saw the 6 heads come down. They moved faster than anything that large had any right to move. 6 of his best men went up. He could hear them calling his name. He could see them in Scylla's mouths, still alive, still reaching toward him. There was nothing he could do. That was the worst part. Not that they died. That they died looking at him and calling his name, and he could not move. He stood in the prow with his spears, and he watched, and he could not do anything at all. He said afterward that of all the things he had seen in his wanderings, that was the hardest. Men he had known for 10 years, reaching for him as they were carried away. They cleared the strait. They sat with the oars still in their hands and looked at each other and did not speak. The island of Thrinacia was visible ahead. Odysseus knew what it was before they landed. Tiresias had told him. Circe had told him. The sacred cattle of Helios, the sun god, lived on this island. Helios drove the sun across the sky each day, and these cattle were his, 350 of them, golden-horned and white, perfect animals that neither aged nor reproduced, sustained by something other than ordinary time. They were sacred, not in the casual sense that some things are described as sacred. In the absolute sense, that meant they were under divine protection, and harm done to them was harm done directly to a god. Odysseus gathered the crew and told them this before they landed. He had them swear oaths. Do not touch the cattle. Whatever happens, whatever we run out of, do not touch the cattle. They swore, they meant it. The storm came that night, not a short storm. The kind of storm that sets in and decides to stay. South wind, then west wind, then just wind from every direction, with no rest between them. The sea was impossible to sail. They pulled the ship up and waited. They waited a week. They waited 2 weeks. Circe's provisions ran out. They fished. The sea was too rough for good fishing. They hunted birds. There were not enough birds. The cattle grazed on the hillsides. Golden-horned and indifferent, and the men watched them the way starving people watch food they cannot eat. A month passed. Odysseus went alone into the interior of the island to pray. To ask any god who was listening for guidance, he prayed for a long time, and the god sent him sleep instead of an answer. While he slept, his lieutenant Eurylochus made an argument to the rest of the crew. Eurylochus was not a bad man. He was a man who had survived too much for too long, and whose judgment had been ground down by it. He said to the crew what the crew was already thinking. They had sworn an oath not to harm the cattle, but the gods had many ways of ending a man. If they were going to die on this island of starvation, that was also a death. And starvation was slower than what the gods might do if they killed a sacred animal. Better to die quickly at sea with full stomachs than to waste away on a beach. They would sacrifice the finest cattle properly. They would offer the proper portions to the gods. They would build a temple to Helios when they got home. The crew agreed. When Odysseus woke and smelled the roasting meat, he knew immediately what had happened. He walked back to the beach and saw the fires and the carcasses, and he understood that everything was now different. He did not rage at them. There was no point. He had been asleep. The decision had been made. All he could do now was what all people do when the worst has happened, and it cannot be undone. Go forward. Strange things happened around the fires. The hides of the slaughtered cattle moved on their own. The meat on the spits lowed, not loudly, but audibly. The sound of the animals refusing to be simply meat. The crew did not find this reassuring. They ate quickly and tried not to think about it. On the 7th day, the storm finally broke. They launched the ship and set sail immediately. They were clear of the island. The sea was calm. The sky was blue. And then it was not. Zeus had heard Helios. Helios had gone to Olympus and complained with the fury of a god who has been genuinely wronged. He had threatened to take the sun and shine it among the dead if his cattle were not avenged. Zeus had agreed. The storm that hit Odysseus's ship was not a weather event. It was a sentence. Zeus drove a bolt of lightning into the ship. The mast cracked and fell and killed the helmsman on the way down. Men went over the sides. Another bolt split the keel. The ship came apart. Men were in the water. Men were being pulled under. There was no rallying. There was no saving anyone. There was just the sea and the pieces of the ship and the men disappearing one by one beneath the waves like lights going out. Odysseus held to the keel. He lashed it to the broken mast with the forestay and made something roughly raft-like from the wreckage. He floated. Around him, nothing. No other survivors, the men he had sailed with since Ithaca. The men who had survived Troy and the Ciconians and Polyphemus and the Lastrygonians and Circe and the land of the dead, all of them gone now in an afternoon. Because 1 month of starvation had been too much for their oath. He floated for 9 days. The current carried him. He was beyond ordinary experience at this point. 9 days alone on wreckage in the open ocean is not something the body is designed to survive. It is the kind of survival that leaves marks that do not entirely heal. On the 10th day, the current brought him to an island, and the island was Ogygia, and the woman on the shore was Calypso, and that was how he had come to be there 7 years earlier. That was the part of the story that connected to where we came in. Odysseus stopped speaking. The great hall of the Phaeacians was absolutely silent. Outside, the night had passed while he talked. It was nearly morning. The torches had burned lower. The wine in the cups had been forgotten. No one had moved. King Alcinous spoke into the silence. He said that Odysseus had told his story with the precision of a poet and the authority of someone who had lived it. He said that the Phaeacians had a tradition of helping those who needed to get home. He said that this tradition had never been more clearly called upon than it was now. He asked his nobles what gifts they would give the man before they sent him home. The nobles gave generously. Bronze and gold and clothing and other things that carry the weight of wealth in the ancient world. Alcinous himself gave a gold cup. In the morning, everything was loaded onto the finest Phaeacian ship. The crew was selected, 22 of the best sailors in a nation of extraordinary sailors. At sundown, they feasted one final time. Demodocus the blind bard sang. This time Odysseus asked him to sing something specific. The wooden horse, the night Troy fell. Demodocus sang, and Odysseus listened without weeping. He had spent his tears on that story. There was something in listening to it now. Here, this close to home, that was different from what it had been. He was nearly there. He was days away. He could allow himself to hear the story of where he had been with something that was not quite peace, but was close enough to it. When the feast was over, and the stars were fully out, Odysseus was led to the ship. The Phaeacians had prepared a bed for him on the deck, cushioned with rugs and linen, sheltered from the sea spray. He lay down, the crew pushed off without a word. The oars dipped into the dark water. The sail filled with a following wind, that the Phaeacians knew how to find the way, musicians know how to find the right note. The ship moved through the night the way Phaeacian ships moved, faster than seemed possible, almost without resistance. As if the sea had agreed to cooperate, Odysseus slept, not the shallow, anxious sleep of someone who has been surviving for years, not the sleep of the Lotus Eaters that was really just emptiness, a deep, genuine sleep, the kind that comes when the body finally believes it is safe. When exhaustion so total that it has become just the normal texture of being alive, finally gets permission to become rest. He did not dream, or if he dreamed, the dreams were quiet. The kind of dreams that leave no mark. The ship reached Ithaca before dawn. The Phaeacian sailors knew the harbour, the way that the best sailors know every harbour that might ever receive them. They came in quietly, running the ship's prow gently onto the sandy shore of a sheltered cove. They lifted Odysseus from the deck, still sleeping, and carried him to the shore. They arranged him on the sand, with the gifts from Alcinous stacked beside him. And then they returned to their ship and pushed off and sailed away. They left him on the shore of his own island after 20 years, asleep, and that was the end of the sea. Everything that followed was on land, and the land was Ithaca. Rest here now. Let the ship stop rocking. Let the sound of the waves settle into the soft rhythm of a shore rather than the open sea. Let the darkness around you be the darkness before dawn on a Greek island, warm stone, the smell of wild thyme. The particular stillness that comes just before the birds start. He is home. He does not know it yet. But he is home. Let yourself drift here, in this quiet, between the sea that was and the land that is. In the space between the journey and the arrival. If you are still here in the dark, still listening, still drifting somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, with the Odyssey moving around you like water, then you have come a long way with us tonight. This is the final part, the homecoming, which is what the whole story was always about. Not the monsters, not the gods, not the war, the getting home. The moment when a person who has been away so long, that home has started to feel like something from another life finally stands on familiar ground. Before we arrive there, wherever you are tonight, if you have found comfort in this channel and this story, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment telling us where in the world you are listening from. What is the weather like where you are? What time is it? Are you in the same place you usually listen, or somewhere new? Every comment from every corner of the world is a small gift, a reminder that this ancient story is still doing what it always did, bringing people together in the dark and carrying them somewhere else for a while. Now let us go to Ithaca. Odysseus woke on a beach and did not recognize it. Athena had covered the island in a mist while he slept, which meant that the familiar shapes of things, the hills he had grown up looking at, the particular way the light came off the water in the harbour he had sailed into and out of for his whole life before the war, none of it was visible. He sat up on the sand and looked around and felt the particular despair of someone who has been promised home and has been delivered to a place he does not know. He had been deceived before. He assumed he had been deceived again. He checked the gifts from Alcinous. They were all there. At least the Phaeacians had not robbed him before abandoning him on a strange shore. He walked to the water and looked out at the sea and tried to make sense of the coastline. He could not. He sat down on the sand and wept. A young shepherd came along the path above the beach, or appeared to. He was perhaps 18 or 19 years old, carrying a bronze spear, well dressed for a shepherd. Odysseus stood and went to him and asked, very directly, what land this was, because he had woken on this shore and did not know where he was. The young shepherd's expression shifted into something that was not quite amusement. You must be very far from home, he said, not to know Ithaca. Odysseus did not react the way you might expect. He was Odysseus. His first instinct was not to believe what he was told. His first instinct was to lie and observe. He said he was a fugitive from Crete, a man who had killed someone important and fled with what he could carry. He made up the story as he went, which was a skill he had been practicing his entire life. The young shepherd listened to the whole elaborate fiction, and then he laughed. The mist dissolved. The young shepherd's form shifted, softened, and became someone else, taller and more luminous in a way that had nothing to do with the morning light, Athena. She stood on the beach of Ithaca in the grey dawn, smiling at him with the expression of someone who has been watching someone she is fond of for a very long time and finds them consistently entertaining. You never stop, she said, even here, even now. You were making up a story. Odysseus looked at her. He looked past her at the beach, which he could now see properly, the mist having lifted. He knew this beach. He had known it since he was a child. He knelt on the sand and pressed his hands into it. He knew the way it felt. He looked up at the hills and the harbour and the slopes of the island in the early light, and he recognized all of it. Every detail he had not known, he had memorized until this moment when seeing it again was like something unlocking in his chest. He was home. Athena told him what he needed to know. Penelope was still faithful, still waiting, though under increasing pressure from the suitors who were giving her until the next festival to make a choice. Telemachus had gone to find news of his father, and was on his way back, though the suitors had laid an ambush for him at sea. The suitors themselves numbered more than 100, all of them armed, all of them living in his house. Odysseus could not simply walk through the gates of his own palace. He was a single man, and they were many. He needed a plan. He had always needed a plan, at least that had not changed. Athena touched him with her wand. His skin aged, darkened, loosened over his bones. His hair thinned and turned grey at the temples, and then all the way through, his back curved slightly. The way backs curve when decades of hard work have had their effect. His eyes dimmed to something cloudier. His clothing became rags. He was an old beggar. No one who had not known him well for many years would look twice at him. Athena helped him hide the gifts from Alcinous in a cave near the shore, rolling a stone across the entrance. Then she told him to go to the farm of his swineherd, a man named Eumaeus, who had served the household since before the war, and who remained even after 20 years exactly what a loyal servant was supposed to be. "Go there," she said. "I will bring Telemachus to you. The path to Eumaeus's farm went up into the hills of Ithaca through terrain that Odysseus knew the way people know the places where they grew up, with their feet as much as their eyes, the rocks, the angle of the slope, the smell of the wild thyme and the olive trees. He walked up through it, with the beggar's staff Athena had given him, and with the knowledge sitting somewhere inside him that he was walking on his own ground, and could not say so. The dogs at Eumaeus's farm rushed at him. Old Eumaeus came out shouting at them, and pulled the beggar up off the ground, and apologized and brought him inside. He offered food and wine with the kind of automatic generous hospitality that comes from people who have always believed that strangers deserve to be treated well. He talked about his master, about Odysseus. He talked about him the way people talk about someone they have given up hope of seeing again, but still think about constantly. The king was probably dead, he said. It had been 20 years. But then he told stories about him, the kind of stories that survive in the memory of people who loved someone, the small specific things that are not in any official account. The way Odysseus had always treated his servants, the things he had said, the kind of master he had been. Odysseus sat and listened to himself, being described by someone who had loved him from a different angle than the heroes and the gods had, from close up, from the ordinary human closeness of a household. And he had to sit very still and not say anything. Telemachus arrived the next morning. He had made it back to Ithaca ahead of the suitors' ambush, guided by Athena, and he had come directly here rather than to the palace, following her instructions. He walked into the farm, and Eumaeus embraced him like the son he had never had, and the young man submitted to this with good grace, because he understood that Eumaeus's love for him was genuine and old. He noticed the old beggar sitting in the corner. He treated him with courtesy. He told Eumaeus to go to the palace and tell Penelope privately that her son had returned safely. Eumaeus went. Athena came to the door of the farm. Only Odysseus could see her there. She beckoned, he went outside, and she touched him again, and the disguise fell away. He stood in the doorway of the swineherd's farm on his own island in his own body for the first time. He went back inside. Telemachus looked up from the fire. He saw a man who had not been in the room before. A man who was not old, a man who was looking at him with an expression that he had no category for, having never seen it before. He said carefully that he thought the stranger must be a god, because people did not change like that, did not simply become someone else between one moment and the next. Odysseus said he was not a god. He said he was his father. Telemachus looked at him for a long moment. He wanted to believe it. He had been wanting to believe it for 20 years. In the way that you want something so badly that you stop letting yourself want it, because the disappointment when it turns out not to be true is too much. He said that this was not possible. His father was dead or lost forever at sea. Odysseus said it was Athena who had changed his appearance. He said he was truly himself. He said what only his father would know to say. Not a secret code, not a password. Just himself, speaking as himself, in the way that people who know each other well can tell each other apart from any imitation. Something in Telemachus shifted, he believed. And then he was across the room, and his father was holding him, and both of them were weeping, the way people weep when something they had stopped hoping for has happened anyway. 20 years collapsed into the space of an embrace. The infant Odysseus had yanked his plough aside to save was a man standing in his arms. The man Telemachus had built his entire life around the memory of was real and present, and here they held each other for a long time. When they separated, they sat and talked with the particular intensity of people who have much to say and not enough time to say it in. Odysseus needed to know about the suitors, how many, who were the worst, what weapons they had, what allies, what access to reinforcements. Telemachus answered everything precisely, and Odysseus listened with the focused attention of a man doing mathematics in his head, calculating the shape of a problem that had to be solved and would only have one chance at being solved. The plan that emerged between them was elegant in the way that Odysseus's plans always tended to be elegant. It relied not on overwhelming force but on misdirection and timing. Odysseus would go to the palace as the beggar. Telemachus would make sure all the weapons were removed from the great hall. He would tell the suitors he was taking the weapons to store them safely, that the smoke from the fire was tarnishing them, that weapons unused by their proper owners should not sit out in the open. They would leave only enough for the four of them when the moment came: Telemachus, Odysseus, Eumaeus, and one other loyal servant they would identify. No one else was to know, not even Penelope. Odysseus said this specifically and said it seriously. Not even Penelope, not yet. Telemachus understood, even if he found it hard. When Eumaeus returned, Odysseus was the old beggar again. Telemachus was simply sitting by the fire. Nothing had changed that anyone could see. The next morning, Telemachus went ahead to the palace. Odysseus and Eumaeus followed later. They came down from the hills of Ithaca into the lower ground where the palace was, walking the path that led along the stone wall around the estate. And on the dung heap beside the wall, something moved. A dog. Old beyond the ordinary scale of canine age, thin and covered in the ticks and parasites that accumulate on animals that no one is caring for properly. He lay in the dung the way very old animals lie. Without the energy to find somewhere better, his body having reduced its requirements to the minimum, but his ears had moved when Odysseus's footsteps came near, and then his head turned. And the eyes that found Odysseus in the crowd of no one at all, in the crowd of just one old beggar and a swineherd on a path by a wall. Those eyes focused. This was Argus. Odysseus had raised him from a pup. He had trained him himself before the war. He had been a remarkable hunting dog, fast and keen-nosed, the kind of dog that people notice and ask about. That had been 20 years ago. Eumaeus told the beggar about the dog as they passed. Belonged to the old king, he said. Finest dog on the island once. But the king went to Troy and the dog had no one to care for him properly, and this was the result. Argus could not stand. His body was too old and too compromised for that, but his tail moved, just slightly, just the last available gesture of recognition from a body that had very little left to give. And his eyes stayed on Odysseus, seeing through the disguise the way dogs sometimes see, through things that fool humans entirely. Odysseus walked past. He had to walk past. Any hesitation, any deviation from the role of an old beggar who had never been here before could undo everything. He turned his face away and pulled his cloak up, because that was the only thing available to him when everything else was unavailable. He kept walking. Behind him, Argus put his head down on the dung heap. He had waited 20 years. He had seen what he was waiting to see. He closed his eyes. He had been holding on for this, and now he did not need to anymore. Odysseus did not look back. If he had looked back, he could not have continued, and he had to continue. The great hall of his own palace. He entered it as a beggar, the last person anyone would look at twice. He had forgotten, somehow, in all the years and all the distances, just how loud they were, the suitors. Over 100 of them in the middle of the day, already into the wine. The servants moving among them, with the practiced invisibility of people who have learned to make themselves very small. Telemachus saw him come in. He gave no sign of recognition. He simply told a servant to give the old beggar a seat near the door and something to eat. Odysseus moved through the room. He went to each table and asked for bread. Some gave, some did not. He was watching everything, counting, assessing the exits, the spaces between the tables. Who sat where? Who was armed with more than a dinner knife? Who was drunk enough to be slow when the time came? He was making a map of the room in his head, the way soldiers make maps of terrain they will have to fight over. There was another beggar in the hall, a man named Iris, who had been there long enough to consider the great hall his territory. He was large and loud and accustomed to being the only beggar present. He threatened the newcomer and demanded he leave. The suitors found this entertaining. They pushed the two men toward each other. A beggar fight was the kind of cheap entertainment that people who have been eating someone else's food and drinking someone else's wine for months can still find amusing. Odysseus looked at Iris. He judged him. Big but soft, loud but not dangerous. He hit him once carefully, hard enough to end the matter without killing the man, or revealing that the old beggar could throw a punch that would kill most people. Iris went down. The suitors cheered. They liked the old beggar now. They offered him wine and the best portions of the meat. He was useful to them. Entertainment, a resource. They had no idea what he was. That evening, word came down from the upper rooms that the queen would see the beggar. Penelope had heard there was a traveller in the hall who claimed to have news of Odysseus. She received visitors like this regularly. It was how she had spent 20 years, listening to travellers and their stories, always hoping one of them would finally have something true to say. Odysseus climbed the stairs of his own house. He came into the room where Penelope sat by the fire. She was 20 years older than the last time he had seen her. He had known that she would be. It had not prepared him for it. The particular way a person ages is something you cannot predict from their face at a younger age. The lines were where grief had sat for a long time. The patience in the way she held herself was not the patience of a person who was naturally patient. It was the patience of a person who had needed to become patient and had succeeded at enormous cost. She was more beautiful than he remembered, not in spite of what the years had done. Because of it, she looked like someone who had lived through something real. He sat across from her in the beggar's chair, and she asked him questions. Who was he? Where had he come from? Had he truly seen Odysseus? He told her he had met Odysseus years ago in Crete. He described him with the precision that only comes from perfect memory. The cloak he had worn, dark red, double-folded, with a golden clasp in the shape of a hound, holding a dappled fawn in its forepaws. Penelope's hands stilled in her lap. She had made that cloak. She had fastened that clasp herself the morning he sailed for Troy. Her face did not change in any obvious way, but something shifted behind her eyes. She wept quietly, the way people weep who have had so much practice at it that it no longer requires any drama. It is simply what happens when the grief that lives just under the surface of everything finds a small gap. She told the beggar that she had given that cloak to Odysseus herself. She said she doubted he would ever come home now. She said it had been too long. Odysseus, sitting across from his wife in his own house in a beggar's rags, told her that Odysseus was coming. He said it with a certainty that was not performance. He said the man was close. Before the next moon rose, Odysseus would be on Ithaca, and would deal with every man who had dishonored his house. Penelope looked at him. She had been looked at by a great many people over 20 years, who told her things they wanted her to believe. This was different from that in a way she could not entirely name. She accepted it the way she accepted most things at this point, with a measured hope that did not commit to anything, but did not quite close the door either. She called for the old nurse. Her name was Euryclea. She had been in the household since before Odysseus was born. She had nursed Odysseus as an infant. She was old now, very old, but present. Penelope asked her to wash the beggar's feet. It was a gesture of hospitality, the washing of a guest's feet, and it meant something. It was the offer of full welcome. Euryclea brought the basin and the warm water. She knelt and began to wash the old man's feet in the firelight. Her hands moved over the bones and the skin of his feet with the practiced attention of someone who has washed a great many feet over a long life. And then her hands stopped. There was a scar on his thigh, an old scar, white and long-heeled from a boar's tusk. He had been hunting on Parnassus with his grandfather as a young man, and the boar had gotten him before the spear went in. She had dressed that wound. She had sat with him while it healed. She knew that scar the way she knew her own hands. She looked up, the basin fell from her hands, the water spread across the floor. Her mouth opened. Odysseus caught her wrist before the sound came out. He held it firmly and not unkindly and shook his head. Just slightly, just enough. Not yet, he said quietly. If you love me, not yet. Euryclea looked at him for a long moment, everything she wanted to say, everything she was feeling after 20 years of praying for this moment, had to go back inside her for a little longer. She nodded. She set the basin upright. She continued washing his feet. Her hands were shaking. Penelope, who had been looking at the fire and thinking, had not seen any of this. She turned back to the beggar when the washing was done and said she had been thinking. She had made a decision. She was going to hold a contest. Odysseus's great bow was in the storeroom. It had been there since he left. It was an extraordinary weapon that he had received as a gift from a friend years before the war. No one else had ever strung it. It required a particular combination of strength and technique that Odysseus had spent years developing. She would set up 12 axes in a row, all with ring handles aligned, and she would challenge the suitors to string the bow and shoot an arrow through all 12 rings. Whoever could do it would have her as his wife. She said this calmly. The way people say things they have already accepted the inevitability of. She had held the suitors off for as long as she could. She could not hold them off any longer. She had to give them a path to victory, even if she did not want any of them to take it. Odysseus told her that this seemed wise. He said it with a neutrality that must have required everything he had. He said that Odysseus would return before any of them could string that bow. Penelope thanked him for his kindness in saying so. She did not believe him. She went upstairs. The next morning the great hall was laid out for the contest, the 12 axes in a row, their rings aligned by Telemachus's hands, the great bow brought from the storeroom. Penelope came down and stood with the bow in her hands and announced what she had told the beggar the night before. The suitors stirred and murmured and leaned forward. This was what they had been waiting for. The end of the waiting. Telemachus tried first. He was his father's son, and there was always the possibility that he had inherited his father's strength and his father's technique. 3 times he tried to string the bow. The 3rd time he nearly managed it. Something in his face changed when he felt the bow begin to yield. He caught his father's eye from across the room. Odysseus gave the smallest shake of his head. Telemachus let the bow spring back and said he was not strong enough and moved aside. The suitors went one by one. Some of them were strong men. Some of them had spent years at athletic pursuits and thought of themselves as capable of most physical challenges. None of them could string the bow. They tried everything. They warmed it by the fire. They rubbed it with fat to soften it. They tried technique, and they tried brute force, and they failed with each. The afternoon wore on. The mood in the hall shifted from anticipation to frustration, to something closer to humiliation. During the contest, Odysseus had slipped out to the courtyard. He had found 2 men he needed to find. Eumaeus, the swineherd, and Philoetius, the cowherd, another man who had served the household faithfully for years, and who, it was clear from his face when he spoke of his missing master, was still loyal to the man, rather than to whoever happened to currently be consuming his master's estate. Odysseus showed them his scar. Both men wept. Both men said they would fight for him. He told them what he needed. When the time came, Eumaeus was to bring the bow to him regardless of what the suitors said. Philoetius was to bar the outer courtyard gates. That was all. He would handle the rest. Back in the hall, the last suitor had failed. There was a suggestion that they leave the contest until the next day. The old beggar asked mildly whether he might try. The suitors found this amusing, and then quickly found it threatening. A beggar who could string Odysseus's bow would be an embarrassment they could not afford. They said no. Telemachus overruled them. The bow was his by inheritance, he said, and he decided who could try. He did it with a firmness that surprised everyone who was used to him being quiet. Penelope supported the beggar's right to try. She was overruled by Telemachus in turn, gently, and sent upstairs. She went, confused by something she could not yet name. Eumaeus carried the bow to Odysseus. The suitors shouted at him to put it down. Telemachus told him to keep going. Eumaeus put the bow in the hands of the old beggar. In the outer courtyard, Philoetius quietly dropped the bar across the gates. Odysseus held his bow. He turned it in his hands the way people handle familiar things after a long absence, checking for damage, feeling the weight of it, remembering. The suitors watched him with expressions that ranged from contempt to wariness, some of them beginning to feel. Without knowing why that something was changing, he strung it as easily as a man strings a lyre. One smooth motion and the string was set and the bow was complete. The hall went completely silent. He plucked the string. It rang, a single pure note, the note of a bowstring that has been properly made and correctly strung. From outside, somewhere above the palace, thunder rolled, a sound like an approval. Odysseus fitted an arrow. He sat on the stool. He did not stand. He shot from the sitting position, as he had always done when he was practicing at home before the war. He drew and released in one motion. The arrow went through all 12 rings without touching any of them. It buried itself in the far wall. There was a moment, just a breath. Just the space between what had just happened and the understanding of what it meant. Then Odysseus stood. He stripped off the beggar's rags. He was himself. He was Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca, and he had been away from his own home for 20 years, and he was here now, and there were over 100 men in his great hall who had eaten his food and drunk his wine and courted his wife and plotted to kill his son, and he had an arrow on the string, and he was done waiting. The first arrow found Antinous, the ringleader, the cruelest of them, who had thrown a stool at the old beggar, who had been the loudest voice in every plan to harm Telemachus, who had never wasted a moment's thought on the possibility that the man he was trying to replace might come back. He was lifting a golden cup to his lips when the arrow hit his throat. He never knew what was happening. He simply stopped. The suitors scrambled. They reached for the walls where weapons hung and found empty pegs, because Telemachus had moved the weapons the night before, as his father had asked. They reached for their own swords, which they had. They threw tables. They called out that this was madness. Eurymachus, who was the second in command of the suitors and the smoothest talker among them, tried to speak. He had been talking his way through situations his entire life. He tried to put the blame on Antinous. He tried to offer restitution. He tried to find the words that would make this situation stop being what it was. The second arrow did not let him finish. Telemachus and Eumaeus and Philoetius had gone to the storeroom and come back armed, 4 men, against more than 100. The arithmetic looked impossible. But the great hall was enclosed, and the doors were barred, and the suitors had no long weapons, and the archers had arrows, and there was only one direction for the suitors to run, and it was toward men who were ready for them. The suitors tried to organize themselves. A few of them retrieved some spears through a back passage. They threw them. Odysseus and Telemachus and the 2 servants stepped aside, and the spears went into the walls. Athena was present in the room in a way that was felt rather than seen, deflecting and redirecting, making the aim of the suitors less accurate than it would otherwise have been, making the defenders more precise. It was not an even fight. It was not supposed to be an even fight. It was a reckoning. When it was over, the great hall was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet after violent things happen. The silence made of absence rather than peace. Odysseus stood among the fallen. He was breathing hard. His arms ached the way arms ache after archery done quickly and without rest. He looked at his son across the hall. Telemachus looked back at him, both of them carrying what this moment meant in ways they would not fully understand until later. The loyal servants were separated from the disloyal ones. The hall was cleaned. Smoke was burned to purify it. The old nurse Euryclea was called. She came in expecting to see she did not know what, and found her master standing in the middle of his own hall, finally clean and finally visible, and she lifted her hands to cry out in triumph. He stopped her gently. It was not a time for triumph, he said. These were men who had lost their way. Their deaths were not something to celebrate. The killing had been necessary. Necessary was different from something to be glad about. He told her to go to Penelope. Euryclea went upstairs and woke Penelope. She said simply that Odysseus was home and the suitors were dead. Penelope woke slowly and looked at her nurse with the particular expression of someone who has been told wonderful, impossible things before and has learned the cost of believing them too quickly. She said this was not possible. She said that one of the gods had killed the suitors and that Odysseus was dead and gone. Euryclea said no. She said the beggar was Odysseus. She said she had recognized the scar. She said that the man downstairs in the great hall was the king, and he was asking for his wife. Penelope came downstairs. She stood in the doorway of the great hall and looked across the room at the man standing in it. He had cleaned himself. He looked like himself. He looked older, deeply older, in the way that only happens when someone has lived a great deal. But he was himself, the shape of him, the way he stood, the particular quality of his stillness when he was thinking. She did not run to him. She came into the room, and she sat in a chair opposite him, and she looked at him. Telemachus, who was watching, said something about his mother's composure, being made of stone, that she was not even reaching out to him after all this time. Penelope said gently to her son that she and his father would know each other in their own way, and that he should let them be. She sat and she looked at him. He sat and he looked at her. They were in the same room for the first time in 20 years, and neither of them rushed anything. She said she was going to have his bed moved out of the marriage chamber. She said it to the servants. She said they should set up the great bed that was in their room out here in the hall instead. Odysseus stood up. He could not help it. He had been holding everything steady through months of disguise and years of wandering, and the entire brutal evening, and this was the thing that broke through. He said, with a clarity and a precision that was beyond performance, that the bed could not be moved. He had built that bed himself. He had found the olive tree growing in the courtyard of the palace when this palace was being built around it, and he had made the tree into the bedpost, shaping the trunk with his own hands, building the frame around the living wood, inlaying it with gold and silver and ivory, hanging the oxhide straps himself. The tree was still rooted in the earth. The bed could no more be moved than the tree could be moved, unless someone had cut through the living root. Had someone cut through the root? Penelope stood. She crossed the room. She had set this test the way clever people set tests, quietly, and without announcing that it was a test, with only one person in the world able to pass it, the secret of the bed. The bed built around a living olive tree, rooted in the earth. No one but Odysseus knew that no one who had heard it second-hand could have described it with that certainty, that fury, that specific grief at the idea of the tree being cut. She put her arms around him, 20 years closed like a door. She said she had not been cold or hard. She had been afraid. She had been afraid of being deceived, of giving everything to someone who was not him, of opening herself to a grief deeper than the one she had been living with. She had needed to be sure. She was sure now. They stood in the middle of the hall that had been cleaned and purified and was empty now of everyone except themselves. They stood there and held each other in the way that people hold each other when the holding has been postponed for so long that the act of it carries 20 years of weight. They talked through the night. Odysseus told her his story, all of it, from the moment he left Troy to the moment she had walked into the room. She listened the way she had always listened to him, with her full attention, and without trying to edit the things that were hard to hear. She told him what it had been like here, the years of waiting, the suitors, the schemes she had used to hold them off, the shroud she had woven and unwoven for 3 years, to Telemachus growing up without him, the daily choice to keep believing when there was no evidence that belief was rational. Outside the palace the night went on. The island breathed around them, the olive trees and the rocky hills and the dark water of the harbour, and the sky full of stars that had been there all along, through everything unchanged. Eventually they slept. In the bed built around the olive tree, the tree still rooted, still growing, still alive. In the days that followed, Odysseus went to see his father. Old Laertes lived simply on his farm now, having withdrawn from everything when his son did not come home, unable to bear the palace and its people and the daily reminder of absence. He was in his orchard when Odysseus found him, working the earth around the base of a pear tree, bent over his spade, wearing old clothes. He looked like a man who had made his peace with grief by becoming very small, by reducing the circumference of his life until the grief fit inside it more easily. Odysseus stopped at the edge of the orchard and looked at his father for a while before approaching. He wanted to test him the way Athena had tested him on the beach, the way the entire world had been testing him since Troy fell. And then he stopped wanting to. He was tired of pretending. He walked up to the old man and said, simply, "I am your son. I am home." Laertes looked up. He had the eyes of a man who has been disappointed by hope before. Odysseus showed him the scar. He named the trees in the orchard that Laertes had given him when he was a boy, 13 pear trees and 10 apple trees and 40 fig trees and the 50 rows of vines, all of them named and given by his father as the father's gift to a small son who would inherit them someday. Laertes began to weep. The kind of weeping that happens when old men who have been holding themselves together for years finally stop having to. Odysseus held him up because the weeping had taken the strength from his legs. He held his father the way his father must once have held him, upright, steady, providing the structure that the body needed when the emotions were too large for it. The families of the dead suitors gathered on the road outside town. There was anger, there was grief, there were men who had lost brothers and sons, and who were prepared to take revenge for it. The ancient world ran on this logic. Violence answered violence. Blood required blood. It did not happen. Athena intervened. She appeared on the road and spoke to both sides. She said enough had been killed. She said the families would be compensated. She said the cycle would stop here. She said it with divine authority, which is a different quality than human authority. and both sides heard something in it that made further argument feel less possible than it had a moment before. A peace was made, not a perfect peace, not a peace without grief, but a peace. And Ithaca returned to something like itself. The ships were back in the harbour. The olive trees were on the hillsides. The palace had its king and its queen and its prince. The dogs were in the courtyard. The fires were in the hearths. The bread was in the ovens. The ordinary life of a working household was beginning again after 20 years of something that was not ordinary at all. Tiresias had told Odysseus there would still be one more journey, a journey inland with an oar on his shoulder, until he found people who had never seen the sea, who did not know what an oar was, who would ask him why he was carrying a winnowing fan. There he would plant the oar and make his final peace with Poseidon, and then come home, and then grow old there, and then die peacefully, surrounded by people who loved him, of something other than violence. That journey was still ahead, but it was ahead. It was in the future. Not tonight. Tonight Odysseus was home. Tonight Penelope was beside him. Tonight Telemachus was in the palace he had grown up in without his father, and now would not have to be in without his father anymore. Tonight old Laertes had gone back to his farm, but lighter. A man who had been carrying grief for 20 years, and had been given permission finally to set it down, and outside the palace, on the island of Ithaca, the sea moved the way it always moved. The way it had moved before any of this began, and would move long after all of them were gone. The waves came in and the waves went out. The water was dark and ancient and entirely indifferent. It was just the sea. It did not remember Odysseus. It did not know that anything had been resolved. It was simply itself, which it had always been and would always be. And that was enough. The Odyssey ends the way great stories end. Not with a trumpet blast, not with a proclamation of victory, with two people in a bed, in the dark, talking, telling each other what the years had been, making the other person real again, after all the time that unreality had lived in the space where they should have been. Homer, who told this story first, was not interested in triumph. He was interested in something older than triumph, the human need to return, the way a person can be scattered across the world by war and monsters and divine grudges and the simple relentless cruelty of time, and still carry inside them, through all of it, the specific coordinates of home, the exact weight of a wife's hand, the sound of the harbour, the smell of the olive trees on the hill, the bed built around a living tree, still rooted, still growing. We have been travelling tonight for a long time. We have travelled with Odysseus from the fires of Troy, through 10 years of wandering on a sea that kept trying to return him to the deep. We have been to the island of the Lotus Eaters, where memory goes to die quietly. We have been in the cave of the Cyclops in the dark, with the boulder across the door. We have heard the winds whistle out of an ox skin and carry us backward when we were this close to home. We have been in the underworld and heard the dead speak. We have heard the Sirens sing something that no one who heard it could describe afterward. We have been in the strait with the monster on one side and the whirlpool on the other, and understood in our bodies what it is to have no good choice. We have sat on a beach on Ithaca in disguise, and had our own dog recognize us when no one else could. We have walked past him because we had to. We have held a bow that no one else could string. We have come home. You have come home too. Wherever home is for you tonight, you are in it. Whatever the specific coordinates of your rest are, you are settled into them. The weight of you is in your bed or your chair or wherever you are, and the world outside is doing what it always does, moving through its ordinary night, and you are here. That is the whole of it. That is everything Odysseus spent 20 years trying to get back to. Not adventure, not glory. This, just this, the specific quiet of a specific place where you belong. If you have enjoyed this journey through the Odyssey, and you want to travel through more of history's greatest stories, please subscribe to Boring History Narrative, and leave us a comment below. Tell us what story you would like to fall asleep to next. Tell us what part of the Odyssey stayed with you. Tell us where in the world you are, and what the night sounds like where you are. Every comment is a small piece of evidence that this ancient project of telling stories in the dark is still working, that it still does what it always did. Good night. You have sailed a long way tonight. Ret now. The sea will be there in the morning, and so will the story. It always will be.